When I met Jacob in ninth grade, I had no idea he'd change my life. He was the quiet kid with a mop of brown hair, always scribbling in his notebook. Something about his shy smile and awkward charm tugged at my heartstrings, and before I knew it, I was doodling his name in my geometry notebook. We had a sweet, innocent thing back then, our version of a grand love story. We were each other's first everything, first dance, first kiss, first "I think I love you." But life being life, we drifted apart after graduation. I thought he was my first chapter, not realizing he was meant to be my whole book. Fast forward a decade, and there I was, married to Alex, a man who could buy a luxury car in cash without blinking, yet couldn't muster the decency to ask me how my day was. We met when I was 24, a whirlwind romance fueled by candlelit dinners and exotic vacations. At first, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. Handsome, successful, and generous, what more could I want? But Alex was like a mansion with no heat, gorgeous on the outside, but cold and suffocating once you stepped inside. He was a man who wanted control over the house, the money, and, most importantly, me. I couldn't leave the house without him knowing where I was going and why. At first, I chalked it up to him being protective. But over time, it became clear, Alex didn't love me, he loved owning me. Looking back, I wonder if I loved him at all or if I just loved the escape he provided from my small-town life. Whatever it was, the magic wore off quickly. By year 2 of our marriage, I knew I'd made a mistake. By year 3, I felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. The spark between us wasn't just gone, it had never existed. And just when I thought I'd resigned myself to a lifetime of this is good enough, Jacob walked back into my life, and the fire I thought was long dead roared back to life. It all started 6 months ago at a cafe downtown, the kind of place where the air smells like freshly ground coffee and quiet jazz floats in the background. I'd slipped away for some me time, a luxury Alex rarely allowed. The cafe was packed, so I grabbed the last available table near the window and buried myself in my book. That's when I heard it, a voice I hadn't heard in years. "Rachel?" I looked up, and there he was. Jacob. Older, sure, his face was more angular, his eyes framed by faint lines, but his shy smile was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. "Jacob?" I managed, barely keeping my voice steady. He laughed, that familiar laugh I hadn't realized I missed so much. "Wow, it really is you." He asked if he could join me, and for the first time in years, I felt a rush of excitement. We talked for what felt like minutes, but turned out to be hours. He told me about his work as a graphic designer, his passion for travel, and his dog, Max, who he swore was a better conversationalist than most people. He seemed happy, content with his life in a way I couldn't even fake anymore. When he asked about me, I tried to keep it light. "Oh, you know, married life," I said with a forced laugh, waving my left hand for emphasis. I didn't tell him how miserable I was, how I felt like I'd been slowly shrinking under Alex's shadow. I didn't need to. Jacob looked at me for a moment, his eyes searching, and said, "You okay?" It was a simple question, but it unraveled something in me. "Yeah," I lied. He didn't push, but the way he looked at me made it clear he didn't believe me. We exchanged numbers that day, purely as old friends. Or at least that's what I told myself. I left the cafe with my heart racing, feeling more alive than I had in years. Over the next few months, we bumped into each other, coincidentally, at that same cafe. Twice a month turned into once a week, and those once-a-week meetings became the highlight of my life. I knew I was walking a tightrope, but I couldn't stop. Jacob was kind, funny, and warm, everything Alex wasn't. He remembered little things, like how I took my coffee or the fact that my favorite flowers were sunflowers. Alex, for all his wealth, had never once brought me flowers. With every conversation, I felt the walls I'd built around my heart start to crumble. I couldn't ignore the way Jacob made me feel. It was a feeling I hadn't had since high school. Then came the moment I couldn't deny my feelings any longer. One Friday afternoon, as we sipped our lattes, Jacob told me something that stopped me cold. You know, he said, staring into his cup, I had the biggest crush on you in high school. I thought you knew. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I looked at him, my voice barely a whisper. I did know. And I felt the same way. The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. He finally looked up, his gaze locking onto mine. Do you still? I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew it too well. My silence said everything. For the first time in years, I felt something other than numbness. But that feeling came with guilt. I was married, and even though Alex treated me like property rather than a partner, I couldn't ignore the ring on my finger. I told myself I could stop seeing Jacob anytime I wanted. That these meetings were harmless. But deep down, I knew better. After that cafe confession, something shifted inside me. It wasn't subtle or fleeting, it was like the moment the tide changes direction, unmistakable and unstoppable. I couldn't shake the memory of Jacob's words or the way my heart had leapt at the mere thought of what we'd shared back then. It was terrifying. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive, but that aliveness was laced with guilt that gnawed at me like a constant hum in the background. I began to see Alex in sharper relief, noticing all the ways he controlled me. The way his words cut like barbed wire while maintaining an air of casual dismissal. How he always managed to make me feel small, insignificant, like I was just another piece of his empire. He dictated what I wore to dinner parties, how I styled my hair, and even who I could and couldn't speak to. I'd grown so accustomed to the weight of his demands that I'd stopped noticing the toll it was taking on me. But now, the contrast was glaring. Each morning, I woke up with a sense of dread, knowing I'd have to endure another day of Alex's overbearing rules. He always knew where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing. And if I deviated even slightly, there would be consequences, icy silence, passive-aggressive remarks, or outright yelling, depending on his mood. My existence had become a series of careful maneuvers to avoid setting him off. But now, I had a secret. The secret wasn't just Jacob. It was the way I felt when I was with him, free, whole, like I could breathe again. And that feeling, as dangerous as it was, started to eclipse everything else. I tried to bury it, to focus on the life I'd chosen. But no matter how hard I tried, Jacob's presence lingered, like a melody I couldn't stop humming. The guilt worsened when I found myself replaying our conversations, dissecting every glance and gesture, wondering what might happen if I took the leap I was too scared to even admit I wanted. Then Alex began to suspect. It wasn't dramatic at first, just subtle changes in his demeanor. He'd ask me more questions about where I was going and why it took so long. He started checking my phone, something he hadn't done in years, though I'd been careful to delete every trace of Jacob. His possessiveness, already suffocating, tightened like a noose. One evening, as I sat by the window pretending to read, Alex casually mentioned that I seemed distracted lately. It wasn't an accusation, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. I forced a smile and dismissed it, saying I was tired from running errands all day. He didn't push further, but I could feel his eyes on me long after the conversation ended. By the following week, he stopped hiding his suspicions. He told me he didn't want me wandering the city on my own anymore. It's not safe, he said, his tone patronizing, as if I were a child incapable of managing my own life. I knew better. This wasn't about safety, it was about control. The walls of my cage, once invisible, now felt impossibly close. Desperate for some semblance of freedom, I proposed hosting a New Year's party. It was the perfect cover, an excuse to invite everyone we knew, to create a crowd big enough that I could disappear unnoticed. Alex was reluctant at first, but I framed it as a way to showcase our home and his success. His ego took the bait, and he agreed, on the condition that he had final say over the guest list. When I casually mentioned inviting Jacob, my heart pounded as I waited for his response. Alex hesitated, clearly uneasy. Childhood friends, I said, forcing a lightness into my voice. He's married now. It's nothing. That last part was a lie. Jacob wasn't married, but Alex didn't need to know that. He eventually relented, though not without a warning. Don't make me regret this. His words haunted me as the days ticked closer to the party. But the more I thought about it, the more determined I became. I wasn't going to let Alex dictate every corner of my life. If he wanted to play the tyrant, I'd play the rebel. The night of the party arrived, and the house was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. I made my rounds, greeting guests, keeping up the facade of the perfect hostess. But all the while, my mind was elsewhere, my eyes scanning the crowd for Jacob. When I finally spotted him near the bar, my breath caught. He looked nervous, out of place among Alex's high-powered friends, but when he saw me, his face softened. The world seemed to fade for a moment, the noise and chaos around us disappearing as our eyes met. I knew this was dangerous. I knew I was on the edge of something I might not be able to undo. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had a choice. The party unfolded like a well-rehearsed play, every guest dutifully mingling, sipping champagne, and admiring Alex's wealth. I glided through the rooms, smiling at acquaintances, laughing at jokes I didn't find funny, all while keeping tabs on Jacob. He stayed near the edges of the crowd, his discomfort evident. I couldn't blame him, this wasn't his world. But knowing he was there, even at a distance, steadied me. It felt like a rebellion just to have him in the same room. As the evening wore on, I grew bolder. While Alex was distracted, showing off his prized wine collection, I found Jacob near the staircase. My pulse raced as I leaned in, lowering my voice so no one could overhear. "Are you okay?" He nodded, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "This isn't really my scene," he admitted. I felt a pang of guilt for dragging him into my chaos, but the guilt was quickly overtaken by something else, a rush of exhilaration. Being near him, even for a moment, made everything feel bearable. "Stay a little longer," I urged. "Please." Jacob hesitated, then gave a small nod. That was all I needed. Later, when the dancing moved downstairs, the upstairs rooms fell quiet, dimmed by soft lighting and muffled music. It was the perfect escape. I slipped away from the crowd, my heart pounding as I made my way to the guest bathroom. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. I didn't have to wait long before Jacob appeared in the doorway. "I shouldn't be here," he said, though he made no move to leave. "I know," I replied, stepping closer. It felt inevitable, like a current pulling me under. There, in the quiet of the upstairs hall, away from prying eyes, I let my guard down. I let myself feel something I hadn't felt in years, wanted. When I kissed him, it was like crossing a line I could never uncross. And for a moment, I didn't care. The moment was brief, fleeting. Just a kiss, but it carried the weight of everything I'd been holding back for years. My heart was still racing when I pulled away, reality crashing back in. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to, him, Alex, or myself. Jacob's expression was conflicted, a mixture of longing and regret. "This is too dangerous, Rachel." I nodded, unable to speak. He was right. But as he turned to leave, I knew this wasn't the end. Back downstairs, I rejoined the party, trying to act as if nothing had happened. But the weight of what I'd done settled over me like a storm cloud. I caught Alex's eye across the room. He was smiling, toasting with a group of his business friends. For now, he was oblivious. But how long could that last? The days after the party felt like walking a tightrope stretched too thin. Alex hadn't said anything, and I convinced myself he didn't suspect a thing. Still, the memory of what had happened upstairs wouldn't leave me. It was all-consuming, a mix of exhilaration, guilt, and dread. Jacob and I didn't speak after the party. Not a single text or call. I told myself it was for the best, that maybe he wouldn't want to be part of the mess I'd made. But the silence was deafening, a void that left me pacing the house and jumping at every sound, half expecting Alex to confront me at any moment. Alex, on the other hand, seemed unusually calm. He wasn't the type to let anything slide, especially not if he suspected I was hiding something. But instead of questioning me, he seemed distracted, throwing himself into work and barely paying me any attention. At first, I was relieved. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Was his silence a sign that he truly didn't know? Or was it something worse, an ominous calm before the storm? One night, I sat by the window with a glass of wine, staring out at the darkened street. The party had been almost a week ago, but my nerves were still frayed. I kept replaying that night in my mind, the kiss, the way my heart had raced, the way Jacob had looked at me. I should have been terrified of what Alex might do if he found out, but instead, I kept coming back to the same thought. I didn't regret it. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. For years, I'd told myself I was trapped, that I had no choice but to endure my life with Alex. But Jacob had shown me something I hadn't allowed myself to hope for: an escape, a second chance at the life I'd dreamed of before Alex came along. The thought terrified me. It also thrilled me. The next day, Alex left for work earlier than usual, muttering something about a meeting as he grabbed his briefcase and kissed me on the cheek. His affection felt so automatic, so empty, that it barely registered. I waited until his car disappeared down the driveway before picking up my phone. For a moment, I hesitated, my thumb hovering over Jacob's name in my contacts. What would I even say? Was there anything to say? Before I could overthink it, I typed out a simple message: "Can we talk?" The reply came almost instantly. "Meet me at the cafe. 3 p.m. When I arrived, Jacob was already there, sitting at the same corner table where we'd reconnected months ago. He looked tired, his usual warm smile replaced by something far more serious. I slid into the seat across from him, my heart pounding. The air between us was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. "I shouldn't have come to the party," he said finally, his voice low. "It was a mistake." I flinched, but nodded. "I know. I needed to see you." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Rachel, this is dangerous. You know that, don't you? Whatever this is, it can't happen. Not like this." His words stung, but I couldn't argue. He was right. What I'd done, was reckless. But even as he spoke, part of me didn't care. I wasn't ready to let go. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. "I know it's wrong," I said softly. "But for the first time in years, I feel like I'm alive. I don't want to lose that." Jacob looked at me, his expression torn. "You deserve more than this," he said finally. "But you need to figure out what that means for you, without me complicating things." The finality in his voice hit me like a blow. He wasn't just telling me to end this, he was pulling away, trying to protect himself from the mess I dragged him into. And as much as it hurt, I couldn't blame him. When we parted, I felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. At home, I found Alex waiting in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. He glanced up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. "Busy day?" he asked, casually. I froze, my stomach twisting. "Just running errands," I replied, forcing a smile. He nodded, his eyes lingering on me for a moment too long before returning to his screen. As I walked upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. December at Alex's house was always a parade of excess, a towering Christmas tree adorned with glass ornaments that cost more than most people's monthly rent, garlands strung with precision, and an endless list of carefully curated guests for the annual New Year's Eve party. On the surface, it was glamorous, but to me, it felt suffocating, a gilded prison dressed up in twinkling lights. This year, the preparations felt different. Or maybe I was different. The glittering decorations and pristine table settings didn't excite me like they once had. Instead, they felt hollow, like props for a play I no longer wanted to star in. Alex was in his element, micromanaging every detail of the event. From the wine selections to the jazz trio he insisted on hiring, he controlled it all. I moved through the house like a ghost, nodding and smiling at his endless instructions, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought about Jacob. About that kiss. It had been weeks since the party, and I hadn't seen or spoken to him since our meeting at the cafe. I told myself it was for the best, but his absence left a void that nothing else could fill. I replayed that moment upstairs over and over, the way his lips had felt, the way my heart had soared despite the wrongness of it all. Alex, meanwhile, seemed preoccupied. If he suspected anything, he didn't show it. He was as meticulous and distant as ever, spending most of his evenings in his office or on the phone with his business associates. Sometimes, I thought he might be deliberately avoiding me. Or was he just watching, waiting? I couldn't tell. The guest list for the New Year's Eve party was finalized a week before the big night. Alex handed me the printed list like it was a business contract, expecting my approval. I scanned the names, a familiar pit forming in my stomach when I saw Jacob's. "Is this okay?" Alex asked, his tone casual, but his gaze sharp. I hesitated, feeling the weight of his scrutiny. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "He's just an old friend." Alex didn't respond, but his expression lingered in my mind long after he walked away. The days leading up to the party were a blur of activity. Caterers came and went, the house was scrubbed to perfection, and deliveries piled up in the foyer. I went through the motions, but my mind was racing. What would happen when Jacob walked through that door on New Year's Eve? Would I be able to control myself? Would Alex notice? Each night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between excitement and dread. The stakes were higher now. One wrong move, and Alex would see everything. On the morning of December 31st, Alex left early for a meeting, leaving me alone to oversee the final preparations. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps from the staff. I wandered into the dining room, where the table was already set for the evening, fine china, crystal glasses, and a centerpiece of white roses and silver candles. It was perfect, flawless, and utterly empty. Just like my marriage. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the truth I'd been avoiding for weeks. I didn't just want Jacob. I wanted out. Out of this life, out of this house, out of the stranglehold Alex had on me. But was I brave enough to take the leap? The clock was ticking, and soon the house would be filled with guests, laughter, and music. And Jacob. New Year's Eve was supposed to be a time for new beginnings, wasn't it? So why did it feel like the end? The house transformed as the evening set in. By 8 p.m., the first guests had arrived, and the air filled with the clinking of champagne glasses and the low hum of polite conversation. Alex, dressed in a sharp black suit, greeted everyone with his signature charm, basking in the attention like a king holding court. I played the dutiful hostess, moving from group to group, smiling, laughing at jokes I didn't hear, and making sure no one's glass stayed empty for long. On the surface, I was the picture of grace and composure. Inside, I was unraveling. Every time the doorbell rang, my pulse quickened. Would it be him? It was nearly 9:30 when Jacob arrived. I spotted him immediately, lingering near the doorway, scanning the crowd with a mixture of unease and curiosity. He wore a dark blazer over a simple shirt, looking both handsome and painfully out of place among Alex's high-powered crowd. Our eyes met across the room, and my breath caught. For a moment, the noise around me faded, and all I could focus on was him. He gave me a small, almost hesitant smile, and I knew he felt it too, the pull, the weight of unspoken words between us. I excused myself from the conversation I was pretending to follow and made my way toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. But before I could reach him, Alex appeared at my side, his hand resting lightly on my back. "Old friend of yours?" Alex asked, his tone polite but laced with something sharper. "Yes," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Jacob and I went to school together." Alex nodded, extending a hand toward Jacob. "Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming." Jacob took his hand, his expression carefully neutral. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. Thanks for having me. Beautiful home. Thank you, Alex replied smoothly, his eyes flicking between us. He lingered for a moment longer, as if assessing something, before turning to greet another guest. As soon as Alex was out of earshot, Jacob exhaled, looking at me with a mixture of warmth and caution. You okay? He asked quietly. I nodded, but my throat felt tight. I didn't think you'd come. You asked me to, he said simply. His words hit me harder than they should have. I wanted to say more, to pull him aside and explain everything, but the moment was broken when another guest approached us, drawing me into a conversation about holiday travel plans. I glanced back at Jacob, but he had already melted into the crowd. The night pressed on, and I barely saw him. Each time I caught a glimpse of him, he was surrounded by other guests, keeping his distance as if he knew it would be safer that way. But the tension between us was unbearable, a constant undercurrent that made it impossible to focus on anything else. Alex, meanwhile, was in his element, holding court in the living room with a glass of scotch in hand. He seemed relaxed, even jovial, but every so often, I caught him watching me. His gaze was steady, calculating, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By 11:30, the party had reached its peak. The band played a lively tune, and the living room buzzed with energy as guests danced and toasted to the coming year. I tried to lose myself in the crowd, but my nerves were fraying. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped upstairs, needing a moment to breathe, to think, to figure out what the hell I was doing. The quiet of the upstairs hall was a stark contrast to the chaos below, and I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes and taking a deep breath. I didn't hear the footsteps until they were right behind me. Rachel. I turned to find Jacob standing there, his expression conflicted. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us heavy with everything we couldn't say. I shouldn't be here, he said finally, his voice low. But neither of us moved. The hallway stretched out before us, quiet and dimly lit, with only the faint hum of music drifting up from below. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Jacob stood just a few feet away, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his jaw tight. He looked like he was battling something inside himself, a struggle I knew all too well because I felt it too. I wasn't sure if I'd see you, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes softened, and he took a hesitant step closer. I wasn't sure I should come, he admitted. But I couldn't stay away. The air between us felt charged, electric. I glanced toward the staircase, half expecting Alex to appear at any moment, his sharp gaze slicing through the fragile bubble we'd created. But the hall remained empty, the party below oblivious to what was unfolding upstairs. You shouldn't have come, I said, even as every fiber of my being screamed the opposite. Jacob smiled faintly, a mix of sadness and understanding. I know. I pressed my back against the wall, feeling the weight of the evening pressing down on me. This is so dangerous, Jacob. I know that too. He took another step closer, and my breath hitched. We were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't undo, and we both knew it. Downstairs, the party roared on. Laughter and clinking glasses mingled with the sounds of the band, a sharp contrast to the tense stillness in the hall. For a moment, I imagined the chaos that would erupt if Alex walked in and saw us like this. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. But instead of pulling away, I stayed frozen, trapped between the life I was supposed to have and the life I wanted. I've been trying to stay away, Jacob said, his voice raw. To give you space. But, he trailed off, shaking his head as if frustrated with himself. You deserve so much more than this, Rachel. You know that, don't you? I swallowed hard, his words cutting through me. It's not that simple. It is, he said firmly, his eyes locking onto mine. You just have to decide what you want. What I wanted. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. I had spent so long bending myself into Alex's vision of the perfect wife that I had forgotten how to dream for myself. And now, here was Jacob, offering me a glimpse of something I thought I'd lost forever. But I couldn't ignore the reality of my situation. If Alex finds out, I began, but the words caught in my throat. Jacob stepped closer, his expression pained. You're scared of him. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. I didn't respond, but the silence was answer enough. The sound of footsteps on the stairs jolted us both, and I instinctively stepped back, my heart pounding. A woman's laughter echoed from below, and the footsteps retreated just as quickly as they'd come. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. This isn't fair to you, he said, his voice low. Or to me. I nodded, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I know. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. But neither of us moved. Finally, Jacob broke the silence. I should go. The thought of him leaving sent a pang of panic through me, but I forced myself to nod. Okay. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine one last time. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving me alone with the weight of everything unsaid. As I made my way back downstairs, I felt like I was walking on a tightrope stretched too thin. My heart was still racing, and my hands trembled as I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, desperate for something to steady myself. Across the room, Alex was talking to a small group of men near the fireplace. He glanced up and caught my eye, his expression unreadable. I forced a smile and quickly looked away, but the unease lingered. Something about the way he watched me sent a chill down my spine. Midnight was approaching, and the countdown loomed like a ticking bomb. The weight of what had just happened upstairs was crushing, but the night wasn't over yet. And I had a sinking feeling that the worst was still to come. The minutes ticked by, dragging me closer to midnight and the inevitable collision of everything I'd been trying to avoid. I moved through the party like a ghost, smiling when necessary, laughing when expected, but my mind was miles away. Jacob was still here. I could feel it, even when I didn't see him. It was as though the space between us hummed with invisible tension, pulling me toward him even as I tried to resist. Alex, meanwhile, was the perfect host, charming, attentive, and utterly composed. But every now and then, I'd catch him watching me, his gaze lingering just a second too long. At one point, I slipped into the kitchen under the guise of checking on the caterers. The noise of the party dulled as soon as I closed the door behind me, and I let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the counter for support. My reflection in the stainless steel fridge stared back at me, perfectly polished, perfectly composed. A lie. I barely had a moment to collect myself before the door swung open, and Alex stepped inside. There you are, he said smoothly, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. I was wondering where you disappeared to. Just checking on things, I said quickly, straightening up and plastering on a smile. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us. You've been quiet tonight. Everything okay? The question was innocuous enough, but the way he asked it made my skin prickle. It was like he was probing, testing the boundaries of what I might reveal. Of course, I said, forcing a laugh. Just tired from all the planning. He studied me for a moment longer, then reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from my face. The gesture should have felt tender, but it only made me feel trapped. You've done a beautiful job, he said, his voice low. The guests can't stop talking about how perfect everything is. Thanks, I murmured, my throat tightening. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Don't disappear for too long. Midnight's coming. With that, he turned and left, the door swinging shut behind him. I let out a shaky breath, my pulse racing. Back in the main room, the party was reaching its peak. The band was playing a lively tune, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Guests clinked glasses and laughed, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of noise. I spotted Jacob near the far corner of the room, speaking with one of Alex's colleagues. He looked uncomfortable, his posture stiff, but when he caught my eye, his expression softened. I should have looked away. I should have stayed on the other side of the room and pretended he didn't exist. But I couldn't. By 11:45, the energy in the room shifted. Guests began to gather near the living room for the countdown, their excitement infectious. Alex moved through the crowd like a politician, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. He seemed calm, confident, completely in control. I, on the other hand, felt like I was coming apart at the seams. Everywhere I looked, I felt eyes on me, Alex's, Jacob's, the guests who saw me as the perfect hostess. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the air grew heavier with every passing minute. At 11:55, Alex appeared at my side, a glass of champagne in his hand. He offered it to me with a smile, his free arm snaking around my waist. "Ready to ring in the new year?" he asked, his tone warm but laced with an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. "Of course," I said, forcing myself to meet his gaze. But as the final moments of the year ticked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to snap. The countdown began as the guests gathered in the grand living room, their voices echoing through the house. The band had shifted to a lively tempo, building anticipation for the stroke of midnight. I stood near Alex, his arm draped casually over my shoulder, a glass of champagne in my hand that I hadn't touched. Jacob was across the room, lingering near the doorway. He avoided my gaze, but I could feel the weight of his presence, like a tether pulling me in two directions. I tried to focus on the laughter around me, the rising chants of 10, 9, but my heart pounded louder than the noise. 7, 6. Alex leaned close, his breath warm against my ear. "Let's make this year unforgettable," he murmured, his tone smooth, almost too smooth. 5, 4. I nodded, smiling weakly, but my legs felt like lead. 3, 2. The room erupted into cheers as the clock struck midnight, glasses raised high, and couples embraced. Alex kissed my cheek, a quick, performative gesture, and turned to clink glasses with a colleague. I saw my chance. I slipped through the crowd, my heart racing as I made my way upstairs. The noise of the party faded with every step, replaced by the deafening thud of my heartbeat. I didn't know if Jacob would follow, but a part of me already knew he would. When I reached the guest bedroom, I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my breath shaky. The room was dimly lit, quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos below. I leaned against the edge of the bed, trying to steady myself, but the adrenaline coursing through me made it impossible. The door creaked open behind me, and I turned to see Jacob standing there, his expression tense. "Rachel," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. I didn't let him finish. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. I crossed the room in 2 quick steps, and before I could second-guess myself, I kissed him. It wasn't like the first kiss, hesitant and fleeting. This one was desperate, hungry, the culmination of weeks of tension and longing. Jacob hesitated for a split second before he gave in, his arms wrapping around me as if he couldn't stop himself. In that moment, everything else melted away, the party, the house, Alex. There was only Jacob, his touch grounding me and undoing me all at once. The sound of the door slamming against the wall shattered the moment like glass. I turned, my stomach plummeting, to see Alex standing in the doorway. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes blazing as they darted between me and Jacob. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. I stepped back, my mind racing, but no words came. Jacob moved in front of me, his stance protective, but it only made Alex angrier. "You think you can just walk into my house?" and Alex's voice broke, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Get out." Jacob hesitated, glancing back at me, but I couldn't meet his eyes. "Go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He gave me a pained look before brushing past Alex, leaving me alone to face the storm. Alex slammed the door shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the room. "How long?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the silence. I opened my mouth to speak, but he didn't let me. "How long has this been going on?" he roared, his anger barely contained. I flinched, tears stinging my eyes. "It wasn't." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, stepping closer. "In my house? At my party?" I shrank back, the weight of his rage pressing down on me. For years, I had feared this moment, the moment Alex's tightly controlled exterior would crack and reveal the man beneath. And now, here we were, the carefully constructed life we'd built crumbling around us. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for this to happen?" he repeated, his tone dripping with contempt. "What exactly did you mean, Rachel? Because it looks like you meant every second of it." I couldn't argue. I couldn't do anything but stand there as the full weight of my choices crashed down on me. Downstairs, the party continued, oblivious to the destruction happening just a few steps away. But I knew there was no going back now. The party ended hours ago, but the silence in the house felt deafening. Guests had filed out one by one, oblivious to the implosion that had occurred upstairs. Now, I sat alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at the untouched glass of champagne on the table. Alex had left. He didn't say where he was going, he simply grabbed his coat, slammed the door, and disappeared into the night. Part of me was relieved. The other part was terrified of what he might do when he returned. The events of the night played on a loop in my mind. Jacob's kiss, Alex's rage, the look of betrayal etched on his face, it was all too much. I wanted to cry, scream, run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the weight of what I had done. For years, I had told myself I was trapped in this life, that Alex's control was an immovable force. And yet, when I finally made a move to escape, it felt like I had only created a deeper prison for myself. By dawn, I forced myself to move. The house was cold, empty, and I knew I couldn't stay. Alex would come back eventually, and when he did, I didn't want to be here. I packed a bag with trembling hands, grabbing only the essentials, clothes, my passport, a few personal items I couldn't bear to leave behind. As I zipped the bag shut, my eyes landed on a framed photo of Alex and me from our wedding day. We looked so happy, so in love. But it was all an illusion, wasn't it? A mirage I had clung to for too long. I set the frame face down on the dresser and walked out of the room without looking back. I didn't know where I was going, but my car seemed to drive itself. The streets were quiet, the city still waking up, and I drove with no destination in mind. All I knew was that I couldn't go to Jacob. Not after what had happened. Instead, I found myself at a small motel on the outskirts of town. The clerk didn't ask questions as I handed him cash and took the key to a room that smelled faintly of mildew. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a place to think. The first call came an hour later. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and my heart stopped when I saw Alex's name on the screen. I didn't answer. The voicemail notification popped up moments later, but I couldn't bring myself to listen to it. The second call came minutes after the first. Then a third. By the fourth, I silenced the phone and shoved it into my bag, trying to block out the world. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. Hours turned into a blur of staring at the cracked ceiling and replaying every mistake I'd ever made. But somewhere in the quiet, between the waves of regret and fear, a single thought began to take shape: this was my chance. For the first time in years, I wasn't under Alex's thumb. Yes, I had destroyed what little stability I had, but wasn't that what I wanted? To burn it all down and start fresh? The thought terrified me, but it also gave me a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning. By the time the sun began to set, I knew what I had to do. I grabbed my phone and scrolled past Alex's missed calls and messages, stopping when I saw Jacob's name. My thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment before I finally pressed call. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Rachel?" His voice was soft, hesitant, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. I need help, I said, my voice breaking. I don't know what to do. There was a pause, and I could hear the concern in his breath. Where are you? I gave him the name of the motel, my heart pounding as I waited for his response. I'll be there soon, he said. As the line went dead, I felt a mix of fear and relief. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The knock at the door startled me. I had been sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands, trying to piece together what came next. For a moment, I froze, my heart pounding as I glanced at the door. It couldn't be Alex, not yet. When I opened it, Jacob stood there. He looked exhausted, his hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled like he had thrown it on in a hurry. But his expression was steady, calm, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft but urgent. I don't know, I admitted, stepping aside to let him in. The room felt smaller with him in it, the air heavy with everything unsaid. For a while, we just stood there, neither of us sure where to start. But then the quiet shattered. The door slammed open with a force that made me flinch, and Alex stormed in, his face a mask of rage. His suit jacket was gone, his tie loose around his neck, and his eyes burned with fury as they locked onto Jacob. So this is where you ran off to, Alex growled, his voice low and dangerous. With him. Jacob stepped forward, his hands up in a placating gesture. Alex, this isn't. But Alex wasn't listening. He lunged at Jacob, his fist connecting with Jacob's jaw, before I even had time to react. The sound of the impact was sickening, and Jacob staggered back, clutching his face. Stop. I screamed, rushing forward, but Alex shoved me aside like I was nothing. You think you can take what's mine? Alex spat, advancing on Jacob again. In my house? At my party? And now here? Jacob tried to defend himself, but Alex was relentless, his anger boiling over in every punch, every shove. The motel room seemed to shrink around us, the chaos filling every corner. Alex, stop. I yelled again, grabbing at his arm, but he shook me off. Jacob finally managed to push him back, his breathing ragged as blood trickled from his lip. This isn't just about you, Jacob said, his voice strained but steady. Rachel isn't property you own. The words only seemed to enrage Alex further. He turned on me, his eyes narrowing. You let this happen, he hissed. You brought this into our lives. I stood frozen, tears streaming down my face as the weight of his words crashed down on me. The commotion must have drawn attention because a sharp knock sounded on the open door, and a motel employee appeared, wide-eyed and nervous. Hey, what's going on here? You need to leave, now. Alex glared at the man, his chest heaving, but he finally stepped back, his fists still clenched. This isn't over, he snarled, pointing a finger at Jacob. You'll regret this. Without another word, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I sank onto the bed, trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. Jacob sat beside me, wincing as he touched his bruised face. I'm so sorry, I whispered, my voice breaking. This is all my fault. No, he said firmly, shaking his head. You didn't make him like this. He did that all on his own. I wanted to believe him, but the guilt was overwhelming. What now? I asked, my voice barely audible. Jacob didn't answer right away. He simply reached for my hand, his touch grounding me in a way I desperately needed. Now, he said finally, his voice steady, we figure out how to move forward. Together. The morning light filtered through the thin motel curtains, soft and pale. It cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the wreckage of the night before, bloodied tissues, crumpled on the bedside table, the faint imprint of Alex's rage still lingering in the air. Jacob was asleep in the chair by the window, his head tilted back, a bruise darkening along his jaw. I sat on the bed, staring at the sunrise, feeling the faint stirrings of something I hadn't felt in years, clarity. Last night had been chaos, raw and unfiltered. But it had also been a turning point. For years, I had allowed myself to live in Alex's world, a pawn in his carefully curated life. And for what? A house I didn't love? A marriage built on control rather than connection? I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could decide what came next. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. Jacob stirred, blinking groggily as he sat up. His eyes softened when they landed on me. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice still hoarse. I didn't answer right away, my gaze fixed on the light breaking over the horizon. "I think I'm done being afraid," I said finally. Jacob frowned, leaning forward. "Rachel, you don't have to rush into anything. Last night was—" "No," I interrupted gently, turning to face him. "I mean it. I've been afraid for so long, of Alex, of leaving, of what might happen if I tried to take control of my life. But I can't do it anymore. I won't." He studied me for a long moment, and then he nodded, a small, encouraging smile playing on his lips. "What do you want to do?" It wasn't easy, but by mid-morning, I knew what had to be done. I had to face Alex, not to fix things, but to end them. Cleanly. Finally. Jacob offered to come with me, but I shook my head. "This is something I have to do alone." He didn't argue, though the worry in his eyes was unmistakable. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as always, pristine, imposing, cold. But I didn't feel the usual knot of dread in my stomach as I walked to the door. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calm, like I had finally stepped into the eye of the storm. Alex was in the living room, nursing a glass of scotch, despite the early hour. He looked up when I entered, his face darkening with anger. "So, you finally decided to come home," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm not staying," I said simply, standing my ground. He laughed, the sound bitter. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me?" "I'm not asking for permission," I replied, my voice steady. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "You don't get to decide when this ends, Rachel. That's not how this works." But for the first time, his threats didn't scare me. I wasn't that woman anymore. "I already have," I said. "I'll be filing for divorce, and you can have the house, the cars, all of it. I don't want anything from you, Alex. I just want my life back." For a moment, he looked stunned, as if he couldn't comprehend that I was finally standing up to him. Then his face twisted in rage. "You'll regret this," he hissed, stepping closer. "No, I won't," I said, meeting his gaze. "Because for the first time I'm doing what's right for me." I walked out before he could say another word, my steps quick and purposeful. As I drove away, the weight on my chest began to lift, replaced by something unfamiliar, but welcome, freedom. Later that evening, I met Jacob at the cafe, where it had all begun. He was waiting for me at our usual table, and when he saw me, his smile lit up the room. "It's done," I said as I sat down, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. His hand covered mine, warm and reassuring. "So, what now?" he asked. I looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky. "Now, I figure out who I am without him. Without any of it." Jacob nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "And I'll be here if you need me." For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was mine to walk. And that was enough. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps.